It's always great to be introduced as a caver because that initially sets the scene as someone who is probably emotionally and mentally unstable before they give the presentation. So welcome to my talk. So I'm going to be talking about what really happens when we pay a ransom. And for the purposes of this talk, I want you to try and leave our initial, obvious, moral hatred of the idea of paying a ransom at the door. And assume that for whatever reason, we're now in a position where this has to be a realistic option that's on the table. And for a lot of businesses, it is. We heard in the last talk how there's been such an increase in ransomware attacks. There's also been an increase in the number of payments and the amount that people have been paying as well, albeit from the very, very, very limited amount of data we actually have on ransomware. So this was said to me by a client, and I run sort of cyber crisis exercises for my clients where we test a situation that unfolds and see how they react. And very early on, about 10 minutes into this scenario that I built, there was a 2-hour-long scenario that escalated and was amazing. Anyway, 10 minutes in, the CEO turns around and says, okay, just pay them whatever they want. At this point, they hadn't even asked for a ransom yet. Which came as a little bit of a surprise. But it actually is something that is contemplated by organizations a lot. It's actually something that I think at some level you need to have a conversation about. You don't necessarily need to write it down or plaster it all over social media or something like that. But I do think it's something that you have to contemplate when you might have to pay a ransom, what those circumstances would look like, and how you'd even go about doing it if you had to pay that ransom, because a lot of organizations simply don't know. So we're going to have a little look at some of the complex ecosystem around ransomware, so the OCGs, the organized crime groups themselves, and some of the things we know about them now, especially this year. Looking at some of the requirements or due diligence on paying a ransom, believe it or not, and how the criminals actually then wash that money through cryptocurrency to clean it to an extent that they can be essentially undetected by law enforcement. So this was the date that Russia invaded Ukraine, and all of us watched, probably in shock, horror, as tanks moved across the border and millions of people were rushing to leave. But it also had a significance for ransomware groups as well, as most of you probably will be able to recall. It did one other thing. There was a ransomware group, a notorious ransomware group, which most of you will have heard of, Conti, and they put out a statement that led to them having a little bit of an insider threat issue, shall we say. So they put out this statement where they fully supported the Russian government and sort of said, you know, don't attack Russia or do anything like that, otherwise we'll come down on you. They put this out and then pretty much immediately regretted it because it got pulled down really, really quickly. And what they'd forgotten was they actually had people who worked for Conti who were in Ukraine. They had people who were in other ex-Soviet countries who didn't find this particularly entertaining. And what ended up happening was, well, information came pouring out. They had a serious insider threat issue, which actually ended up really, really helping us understand how ransomware groups operate, which was great. So what actually did we find out about it? Well, the leaks were extensive. I'm sure most of you have gone through at least part of what was leaked. But there was a lot of really interesting things that came out of it. We knew that ransomware groups were likely to be run in a very business-like manner. We knew that they were pretty sophisticated, both from an organizational standpoint and otherwise. And we knew that they were profit-driven largely. However, in the leaks, we actually found out a lot of really interesting little tidbits of how they were run. Some of them, I guess, were relatively funny. So, for example, they actually had a recruitment issue within Conti. And the HR team that worked for the Conti ransomware group, they actually had problems recruiting talent. And there were loads and loads of discussions on the internal chats that were leaked that were talking about how they couldn't find the right amount of talent. They were mentioning this sort of concept using language very similar to that we use of the skills gap, people putting things on their CV that they're not actually capable of achieving, the irritation that left them with, and things like that. There was also an interesting discussion on the lack of diversity that was being seen in the group, and how that we needed to improve that diversity by attracting other people. And you'd be surprised. I would probably have thought that largely it would be males of a certain age. However, in a lot of the leaked documents, you actually found people who were pretty senior in their career and had been around quite a long time, actually, working in organizations, who had actually applied to join Conti and were talking about the skills that they could bring to the group, which came as quite a surprise. And all this is still on Twitter, so you can go on and trawl through it yourself and see all of the things that were discussed. They also ran an Employee of the Month scheme. They did, which essentially meant that if you were listed as Employee of the Month, you got an uptick in your salary and sort of heralded as doing great work or whatever for the group. And conversely, they would fine people for bad behavior. So they had discussions about how if someone had shown up late for work or logged in late for work or had taken sick leave or hadn't told somebody or all of the sort of things that we see in our own organizations, you got fined. You actually got some of the commission and some of the salary taken off you, and you also got name and shamed publicly within Conti to everyone knows you have done something bad and you will be being fined this month. So a little bit brutal. So they had loads of these sorts of things. And I think it was really interesting because I also kind of made the assumption that ransomware groups were essentially entirely work from home. And I sort of thought that would clearly be what they did, right? But yeah, in the leaks, we saw they had offices. They had office space that they were referring to as the hacker offices. They were talking about equipping that. There was discussions about things like occupational health requirements for repetitive strain injuries. So a lot of it was, if you took the context out of it, if you stripped off the fact that you knew this was a ransomware group, you'd go, this is just any company anywhere in the world, the same kind of problems, the same kind of gripes. So in many ways, they're a dark web Silicon Valley startup, essentially, and they are run very similarly to that, heavily cash flow and profit focused. And there was a lot of discussion in the leaks about moans about staff, and the staff were moaning about how they do all the legwork and they don't get the commission, and why is my manager taking this cut, and why is this person doing that? I'm overworked, I don't get enough holiday. They got holiday as well, paid. Yeah, not too bad. And they had all of these sorts of things that you can imagine you'd see on Glassdoor or anything else like that, right? And crucially, what came out was I would say the disruptive mentality that they had from a business perspective. So if you're talking about them purely in business terms, they were very much focused on brand, very, very, very acutely aware of the brand that they had, which I know sounds like a comedy show, but genuinely they were very concerned about the brand. And this was interesting because this was also reflected in a United States Congress memo about a year ago today, roughly, where they talked about the shift in branding that ransomware groups had experienced and how they'd gone from being kind of aggressive and, I guess, like a tiger to more like a moggy. And they tried to change their brand appearance to their victims to look more warm and fluffy and a little bit less tiger. So how have they done this? Well, for a start, they use incredibly helpful language, and you can see this documented in the US Congress memo that talks about colonial pipeline and attacks such as that. And they use helpful language, and they talk about things like, if you pay the ransom, we'll give you a security report, which will detail how we got into your company, some great things you can do to stop us getting into your company again, and how you can sort of fix all of that. They'll even give you recommended companies that you can approach to help you, when you get the key, restore everything and go back to business, which is brilliant. They sort of have built this kind of ecosystem now where it's almost like a trust pilot for criminals, where we're in this world where you have to keep this crime going. And so from a pure business perspective, if you're a ransomware group and you charge someone, you say, this is the ransom I want you to pay, and I won't dump your data. If they pay you, you have to hold true to that word. Because if you don't, the insurers will know that you don't hold true to your word, so they're not going to pay you. The law firms that are now doing due diligence on ransomware groups won't recommend that you're paid. And they're profit-focused, so they need to have this brand, and they need to make sure that they keep it going. And this is exactly what's happened with Medibank, because obviously they refuse to pay, and so the criminals obviously have to stick true to their word in the opposite direction. And they have to leak the data, because if they don't leak the data, the next victim is going to think, well, they didn't pay, and that data didn't get leaked, so why would I pay now? So this was said by DarkSide in their communications with Colonial Pipeline. When they were having these conversations, they said, we have helped more than 100 companies. So they're really, really good with their comms, and they use language like this all the time in their communications with their victims to phrase themselves and position themselves more as a business partner than they are an attacker-victim relationship. And that's done with the express intent, really, of encouraging you to pay the ransom, encouraging you to have confidence that if you did pay the ransom, you will get everything back, and you will be fine, and your company will go on. But it actually goes further. So not only do they use this helpful language, not only do they communicate with their victims in this kind of business partner MBA language that we are sort of more used to in business, but they've actually started promising and delivering on giving a percentage of the ransom to charity. So DarkSide put out a press statement, and they said, no matter how bad you think our work is, we are pleased to know that we have changed someone's life. That's for sure. So they're very, very talented at comms. They're very, very talented at spinning things in such a way to, I guess, distort our perception of what's actually happened. Because in a physical crime situation, if someone walks up behind you and they grab your handbag and they say, I'm not giving you your handbag back unless you pay me 100 quid, we're pretty confident at that point we've been a victim of crime, right? That's pretty obvious, and everyone we tell is like, oh, you've been a victim of crime. But for some reason, in cyber, that entire perception just breaks down completely. And people are now unaware that they have been a victim of crime. They think they've entered into some really strange negotiation with someone who's now got all of my property. And people actually don't have sympathy either for the victims predominantly. It's, well, why were you so negligent? Why did you let them in? Why are you vulnerable? Why didn't you put these things in place? So we have this incredibly distorted relationship with cybercrime and the effects of it. So let's just say that the worst case scenario has happened. You have your data exfiltrated, you have your data encrypted, and you don't have any real options in any meaningful amount of time to restore that yourself, and certainly to safeguard that data. And you are deciding that you're going to pay the ransom. Your lawyer, your insurer are both recommending that you pay it, saying that these ransomware criminals are all good for it and you should pay. What actually happens, and what do we have to be thinking about if we're going to do that? Well, for a start, you have to be able to set up an account on an exchange, probably, obviously now, not FTX. Awkward. And you have to be able to know how you're going to do that from a business level, right? Because it's not quite as simple as just, oh, I'll just click here, fill in the details, done. That actually is going to take some time. So it may not be the situation that in an absolute crisis where they're saying you've got 12 hours to come up with the money, you might not have the luxury of time to set that account up. So that's something that potentially could be looked at in advance. The other thing you have to be aware of is, oddly, sanctions. So for example, the OFAC recently sanctioned a smart contract mixer called Tornado Cash. And you can't pay money or receive money or transact in any way with that service. And so there are a lot of things that you have to be very careful of in the crypto world that have been sanctioned that you would not be able to interact with as a business because you would be violating US sanctions or UK sanctions. You obviously can't fund terrorism, certainly in the UK, that is a rule. If they're a known terrorist organization, you obviously can't, as a business, send them money for obvious reasons. And ironically, you can't engage in money laundering, which we're going to come on to in a second. Now, a lot of law firms will offer this as a service, a whole due diligence package for you on the attackers and how you set things up and how you audit them, how you make sure you don't violate sanctions and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of questions in your preparation to think about with regards to if this happened, how would I actually do it? So, crypto. Now, the problem has always been with large-scale crime has been the proceeds of crime, right? Because most crime is done for financial benefit, for the most part. And the problem is, you make loads of money, and you have to be able to use that money without law enforcement finding you, tracking you down, and arresting you, right? So the Medellin cartel in Colombia, the accountant for this cartel, Pablo Escobar's cartel, wrote a book. And he talks in his book about how they would have so much cash. They would store it in farms, they would store it in walls, they would store it in fields, they would store it anywhere they could possibly store it because they were making so much money, but they just couldn't clean it in time to use it in any meaningful way. It was too difficult to do that. And so he was saying that annually they would lose $2 billion, so every year $2 billion, to rats. Rats were eating $2 billion a year because that's how long it would take to move this money and clean it. But thankfully, there's a solution. That's the future. And that is cryptocurrency. And it's now relatively easy, painless, frictionless, for criminals to move millions in minutes across cryptocurrency platforms, undetected. And we haven't got an infinite amount of time, so I can't go through every single way you can launder money through crypto. Maybe that's another talk. But some of the key ways that they do this are here. So the first one is mixers. So mixers are what we call a custodial service, which means John, who's hacked all of his victims and he's made all of his money, will pay some money into my mixing service. He'll hand that cryptocurrency over to me, so I now have custody of it. So do you, so do you, so do you. I mix it all up, and I pay it out in seemingly random denominations to different wallets at different times, all pre-agreed with my clients. And at that point, there's a disconnect between where it's come from and where it has now gone. That's essentially not very easy to trace. The problem with mixing services is that they are custodial, which means the criminals have to trust other criminals to handle their money and pay it out, and it all becomes this really weird world where no one really knows who they can trust and who's running off with what crypto. So it's a little bit dog-eat-dog. So that's the mixing services. We also have privacy coins. So in comparison to mixing services, which is essentially like a service, I suppose, privacy coins have privacy built in as sort of a native feature to it, into the protocol. So they're not going to be app-based, they're sort of built in. And this is things like, you would have heard of Monero, very popular currency for ransomware groups to use, Zcash or Zcash if you're American to translate. And all of these basically have privacy built into them in such a way that it's very, very difficult for anyone to trace where something is going and to whom. And there are other ones as well, which we can't go into, such as coin join, chain hopping, and so on and so forth. And people always say to me, oh, well, okay, so how do we implement things like know your customer or know your transaction, like we have in the traditional finance world? And that is technically implemented. And for organizations that operate in the crypto space who want to follow these sorts of rules, they do. But it's also decentralized. So if you don't want to follow these rules, you can also choose to do that as well. And this is the problem that we've ended up with crypto. So back in the day, like I said before with the cartels, their big problem was, how do we monetize this? How do we clean this cash? And now the problem we have is, how do we trace where on earth this money is going and to whom? And it's funding everything, and we don't have visibility at all, really, into the crypto space and where things are going. So one thing people always say to me is, okay, we should ban the payment of ransoms. That is always the default go-to argument. But there are some problems with that, because if we just go out and ban everyone from paying a ransom, ransomware groups don't instantly disappear at the moment that law gets passed. And so there's a lot of collateral damage. And we've seen that with kidnap for ransoms. I've got a video on my YouTube channel about the Italian mafia and how this exact scenario played out. And it is really problematic. And so you would get some pretty serious collateral damage. And this was summarized by the ex-CISO for Twitter, who said that it's somewhat irresponsible if you're a $2 billion company and you're encrypted and you don't have good backups, they just took away your only option. So you just destroyed a $2 billion company. He's got a point, because it's a $2 billion company, or it certainly was before a few weeks ago. And it's a $2 billion company, and it's got employees, and it's got shareholders, and it's got value, and it plays in. So if that disappears, it's not just the fact that the ransomware groups don't get their money, it's the net effect of that on society and on our economy, which is just not sustainable at scale. So if we're sort of going to say we can't get rid of ransoms, we can't get rid of ransomware, can we live with it? Is there a way we can, in some way, live with ransomware? Well, there's a really good quote that I want to end on. And this was said by the lady who said, there's a certain amount of kidnap that works for everyone, which is sort of both really depressing, but also, I think works. I think it makes a lot of sense, right? That maybe the solution is that we cannot actually get rid of it. And certainly if we get rid of ransomware, the chances that it's just cybercrime is just going to go and all of us will be out of a job, I think is probably pretty unrealistic. So maybe we have to think less about these extreme options and more about ways to reduce the prevalence of and impact of ransomware on our organizations and our economy. Maybe there is an amount of ransomware that works for everyone. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.